The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Chad Sievers, today's webinar, if you joined us for previous ones, today's webinar is an hour and a half, so from 12 to 1:30, and we're thankful and welcome that you're here with us to learn about trauma-informed schools. And I'll let our speakers introduce themselves here in a little bit, but if this is your first time joining us, I'll tell you a little bit about our program. Arkansas Building Effective Services for Trauma, or ARBEST, is a state-funded program at the UAMS Psychiatric Research Institute. And our aim is to improve mental health services for children who have experienced trauma from events such as abuse, natural disasters, and family separation. We work really closely with our state's child advocacy centers and other providers here in Arkansas to build a trauma-informed mental health system. And we're probably best known for providing training to mental health professionals and treatments that are effective with helping children recover from trauma. So I just want to welcome you all. Again, my name is Chad Sievers, and I'm going to do a couple of housekeeping slides, and then I'll turn the presentation over to our presenters today. We encourage you all to ask questions. If this is your first time joining on a webinar, to do that, there's a question icon or feature that's on the right side of your screen. You can just type those questions in, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. If you're interested in earning a CEU, just be sure to stick around to the very end of the webinar. We will have a code that's given, and you'll need to enter that into a survey. And as always, it's just a good idea to check with your licensing board in terms of, CE credits and all that sort of stuff. We are recording this webinar, and we'll upload it to our YouTube channel at a later date. And if this topic or other things of this nature are of interest to you, you can check us out on Facebook. We have a pretty active Facebook page and kind of see what we're up to, events, training, that sort of thing. So, well, I'm going to stop talking and let our speakers introduce themselves and their topic for today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Robbins. I'm an LCSW, and I want to just give you a little bit of background of my work history and professional history so you kind of know where I'm coming from and what my experiences are that have influenced me to this point. I moved to Arkansas to work at Arkansas Children's Hospital in 2005 as a child life specialist. And through those opportunities, I was able to work with children and families that would come to the hospital for various reasons, but some of my most exciting events were maybe in the emergency room, where we supported children, helped them understand why they were there, what was going to happen to them, and provide support through procedures or through different events that would happen while at the hospital. From there, I moved on to get my master's degree in social work at UALR, because I found that I wanted to support children and families longer term. Once they were discharged from the hospital, I often wondered what happened to them. Were they getting the supports that they needed out in the community? So through my training, I did some internships out in the community where I got some wonderful experience working with amazing clinicians, doing a lot of trauma work, working with kids who had been sexually abused, through sexual assault, worked with a lot of child advocacy centers, and I've worked at the Child Study Center as a clinician as well. So I've been a clinician for about 12 years, primarily working with children ages 0 to 17 through evidence-based treatments to address trauma. Currently, over the last 2 or 3 years, I've worked with ARBEST to further my desire to be sure that children and families are getting good evidence-based services throughout the community and throughout the state. And so working with ARBEST has really been a treasure for me to be able to support clinicians throughout the state and be able to provide that training and support, and most importantly, to support our kiddos and the families that are out there going through those experiences. I've worked in the school systems where I've advocated for kids who have experienced trauma and help them to get the supports that they need in the school, helped families to get connected to services in their communities so that they can get what they need, just to meet sometimes those basic needs before we can really address the mental health services. So I'm excited today to talk about some of the things that we're just going to consider and think about when we're thinking about a trauma-informed school during all of the things that are going on right now and affecting our children and families throughout the state of Arkansas.
And welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Alyssa Daugherty. I am a child psychology postdoc fellow at UAMS this year. My training and education started at the University of Texas at San Antonio, and I immediately knew that I wanted to major in psychology. And so throughout my undergraduate education, my whole goal was to get to graduate school. And I learned along the way that I wanted to work with children and families who have experienced stressful and traumatic life experiences and learn how I can best support them in the recovery process. So I recently graduated with my PhD in clinical psychology this past May, and I began that journey back in 2012, which seems like a million years ago at this point. But I completed my pre-doctoral internship at UAMS last year, and I have about 4 months left of my fellowship. And so for this past year, I've been working in the Psychiatric Research Institute and the Department of Psychiatry at UAMS. And I work with kids and their families at the Child Study Center here in Little Rock and provide evidence-based treatments to children who have a history of trauma. And I will say I have been very fortunate to join the ARBEST team as part of my fellowship, and I work with truly outstanding staff, trainers, and mentors. And I'm also very excited to talk to you all today. It's been such an honor to be invited to present about this really hot topic of trauma-informed schools. As Emily mentioned, with everything that has happened this year, and even before this year, trauma-informed organizations has been a domain and an area that I have recently learned about and have really enjoyed learning how to teach different organizations and different groups of people about the components that you can take with you. So we are going to, before we dive in, we want to get a sense from who has joined us today. So we anticipate that many of you might work in a school-based setting, but we also know that there may be some others from different settings with us today. And so, Chad, if we can launch that poll. So those of you who have joined us today, if you would just take a second and respond to the poll, let us know who you are, what your position is, and apologies if we missed a major category of folks. We'll just give a little bit of time for people to respond. Okay. So it looks like majority of you that are joining us today are actually mental health providers, which is great. And we do have some school administrators, teaching staff, some administrative staff. So good, we have a good variety of people that are with us today. So we can, let me see if I can advance. Oh, Chad, I don't know if it's advancing. There we go. Okay. So what we're going to talk about today first is just discuss the various types of traumatic life events that children experience, and we're going to highlight some specific information related to COVID-19 and racial injustice pandemics. And Emily is going to review what we know to be a wide range of potential outcomes that result from childhood traumatic events. And that's going to segue us into really the meat of our presentation today. And that is introducing and covering what we call the major building blocks of trauma-informed organizations or trauma-informed schools. So I will say that we will present a lot of information today, which can both be helpful and overwhelming. So I encourage you, as you listen today, identify at least one thing, maybe one idea or one goal that you might be able to focus on as we enter this next school year and those to come, whether that's something that you can implement more immediately, as well as for long-term implementation of trauma-informed practices. And you'll find that some of the information that we will talk about today will be specific to young children, but other information is going to be more general. So I hope that the material is useful and that you can apply that within the age group with whom you work. So we can think of traumatic life experiences as an umbrella. There's a number of events that children and their families may face. And unfortunately, we know that young children in particular are extremely vulnerable to the exposure of trauma and its effects. And as we know, COVID-19 and both historical and recent social and racial injustice has introduced an extraordinary number of additional stressors for children and their families. So what I really want to highlight here is the importance of recognizing that children and their families will vary widely in the combination of traumatic experiences that they have faced. So some children and their families face the stressors that come with foster care due to a history of abuse or neglect. And some have experienced or will be faced with systemic racial discrimination and might be facing financial strain, food insecurity, and maybe even grief and loss, both due to COVID and acts of social injustice. Other families who were not previously facing stressors related to meeting basic needs or other traumatic events now may be. So another thing I want to highlight here is that the breadth and the depth of impact of trauma means that schools, mental health providers, others in early childhood programs will need to focus not just on addressing the effects of students and clients, but also on teachers and school staff, because many of us may have experienced stresses similar to our students or the children that we work with. And so we know that situations when we return to school are going to be very different than normal. School personnel, students, parents are going to face a lot of uncertainty and new processes that seem very unfamiliar. We know that before COVID-19, many children experienced bad and scary events. So here are a few stats for the state of Arkansas. Overall, 1 in 7 children in Arkansas experience abuse and neglect in any given year, and 1 in 4 children will experience abuse and neglect throughout their childhood years. We also know that with recent and drastic changes in our world, that the risk of maltreatment and exposure to trauma has significantly increased. So although there are a number of individuals maybe joining us today that work in professions as mandated reporters, we know that teachers make up the majority of child maltreatment reports. So with children being out of school for a period of time this past year, there may have been children who went unseen and reports that were unmade. So just briefly, I want to give you a scope of the abuse and neglect specific statistics here in Arkansas. So you might see that the most common type of maltreatment is neglect. but the numbers add up more to than 100% because many children experience more than one type of trauma, unfortunately. And on the right-hand side, you may see that really young children or children ages birth to 5 are the most vulnerable to experiencing maltreatment. And they account for 50% of child maltreatment cases in Arkansas. And we know that this age group is most dependent on adults for care. And so they are more vulnerable to experiencing the abuse and neglect from caregivers. And children in foster care specifically have experienced much higher rates of trauma, and the majority have experienced 2 or more forms of interpersonal trauma, like physical and sexual abuse. And about half have experienced 3 or more types of interpersonal trauma. So we know that the rates of child maltreatment and abuse, specifically in Arkansas, but also around the country, are very prevalent. What you see on this next slide are the specific traumas and various stressors that children and their families may be facing throughout both COVID-19 and racial injustice pandemics. So some of these stressors and traumatic events, unfortunately, may not be new to some children and families, but as I mentioned earlier, the number of families that have been or are continuing to face extreme stress is much higher now. Overall, there are increased threats to safety, whether this is perceived threat or actual threat, and children and their caregivers might be facing reminders of historical trauma, like lynching and slavery, previous police brutality, still healing from some of the events that occurred recently, like Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, Emmett Till, and being reminded of both personal and family experiences of trauma. So for some children and parents, they might be more fearful of police, depending on what they've seen, what they've heard, and maybe what they've personally experienced in their lives so far. So in line with our goal today of highlighting both COVID-19 and racial injustice pandemics, we want to present some up-to-date statistics regarding the number of COVID-19 related deaths broken down by ethnicity. So what we see here are individuals who identify as Black and also those who identify as Hispanic, Pacific Islander, and Asian descent have a disproportionate number of deaths compared to those who identify as white, compared to the overall population within these different ethnic groups. So keep in mind that grief and loss and additional stressors that come with losing a loved one might be higher in these ethnic groups. So some of you may have heard of the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACE study. This study was conducted at Kaiser Permanente from 1995 to 1997 with more than 17,000 adult participants. And each study participant completed a confidential survey that contained questions about their childhood, about their family, and this included categories of child maltreatment and household dysfunction within the first 18 years of their life. And the survey also included items about current health and behaviors, which were combined with the results of a standard physical exam. So it's not like it took the ACE study to tell us that these things are not good for kids and these things are not good for families. There's a much longer list of things that aren't good for kids, and that can be traumatic, like natural disasters and racism and car accidents. But this study focused mainly on home life, and this study really illuminated 3 main things. First, these experiences are way more common than we thought. Second, they tend to pile up in kids' lives. For example, if I have a parent in my home who is addicted to drugs, I may also end up with an incarcerated parent. And because we know substance use and violence are highly related, I may also end up witnessing domestic violence or being exposed to dangerous people who might hurt me. And the third thing that we learned from this study is we had been clear for a long time that these experiences are not good for us psychologically, but this study showed us that there are implications and major implications for our physical health. What these graphics show here is the correlation between the number of traumatic events and an increased risk for adverse outcomes. So children in particular have experienced an average of 5 types of traumatic events prior to entering treatment. So it's really important that we remember that trauma has a negative impact on both mental and physical health, and that these two domains of our health really interact with each other. There we go. So what you see here is some common misconceptions that some people have, particularly about young children with trauma histories. So some might believe that young children will not remember trauma. Young children are inherently resilient. If caregivers don't talk about trauma, children will just forget about it. And children can't benefit from therapy. What we know is that children do remember trauma. They may not be able to verbalize or communicate with words, but their bodies remember. And trauma can have significant effects on development and psychological functioning. But fortunately, there are many evidence-based treatments available for young children that help them and their families recover from traumatic life experiences. So you may have gathered so far that trauma is a word that gets used in many different ways. There's a lot that can fall into this category of trauma. What I want to highlight here is that a traumatic event may be a one-time occurrence, such as a serious car accident or one occurrence of sexual abuse. But trauma can also consist of multiple traumatic events or one traumatic event that occurs chronically over time. So in general, we know that the more trauma a child experiences, it reinforces the impact that trauma has already had on a child. Much like trauma can become deeply ingrained within the roots, impacting the brain, the body, and the mind in a really widespread way. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily now to talk about some of the outcomes that we see in children with exposure to trauma.
Okay. So what you see here are the various domains of functioning that can be impacted by traumatic life experiences. And I want to emphasize the word can. Trauma does not determine a child or a person's destiny. I'll talk more about resiliency later, but for the next several slides, I'll talk about how the effects of trauma can impact each of these areas. We can think of a child's development as a staircase with steps, such that different domains of development follow a hierarchy of sorts and progression. Children's overall well-being is, for the most part, dependent on the caregivers that are around them. For example, children grow physically because they are fed. Children learn to talk because someone talks to them. Children develop their sense of caregivers based on their experience with them. When children endure multiple traumatic events over long periods of time, they may be at risk for having multiple gaps in their development. So when a child's development is disrupted by stress or abuse or neglect, it is as if the youth is being asked to climb a stairway with missing steps. As human beings, we typically need our basic needs met, like food and water, before we can learn something new. For a child, it's hard to learn about feelings or how to get along with others when we're hungry. So this is an example of that broken staircase. The traumatic events can happen at any age of the development and interfere with their accomplishments. One example that I think about every time I see this staircase is I think about a young child who was brought into our clinic, and he was about 9 years old because he was entering 3rd grade, and he had been adopted by a great family, a mom and a dad, and he was brought to our clinic because he had been diagnosed with ADHD, and they were struggling with finding the right medication. He was really struggling to learn in school and maintain information. And up to this point, that had all been told to the parents it was because of his ADHD and his struggle to focus and maintain information. Well, as we gathered more information, maybe it's my social work backpack that I wear, but I asked a lot of questions, and I wanted to know who this little boy was before he walked into my office. So as I got to know more about his history, I learned that when this little boy was about 3 or 4 years old, he went into foster care due to neglect and drug use in his home. While he was in foster care, he had a lot of behavioral issues, and so he was moved to a lot of different foster homes. Before coming into foster care, he had never attended a daycare, never engaged with other children. He was only kept at home, mostly in a closed room with very few toys. While in foster care, he stayed there for about 2 to 3 years. Rights were terminated with his mother. He was adopted when he was about 5 or 6, somewhere around that age. So he was starting 1st grade. So around 1st grade is when he was adopted. And ever since he had come into this home, he had really struggled with academics and in his school environment. Well, what we began to think about was, what did his staircase look like before he came into my office? When he was at that young age of learning how to for his body to be healthy and physically developed, he was not getting the food and the nourishment that he needed. So his body was not growing. His brain development was being interrupted because of that lack of nourishment in the early years. Social development, he did not have someone talking to him and singing to him and interacting with him, even peers, until he was about 4 and started going to daycare, and he went to multiple daycares while in foster homes. He never was able to really grow that social development. Emotional development, the connection with caregivers, that was broken numerous times in those early years. By the time we got to the cognitive development age, and I know that cognitive development happens before kindergarten, but in that kindergarten and K4 time, he was in survival mode. He didn't know who was going to pick him up from school that day, where he was going to lay his head, if his teddy bear was still going to be on his bed when he got home that night. He was truly in survival mode. So while other kids were sitting at the table, learning to write their name, learning to read, learning all of those basic academic pieces, everything you ever need to know you learned in kindergarten. Well, in kindergarten, he was just learning how to survive. So as his academic years began to grow, his broken staircase at the bottom did not give him a solid foundation to be able to grow and to be able to develop. And so we began to just look at this kiddo and his needs a little bit differently, just based on that gap of development with those staircases and all of those pieces that were broken in the beginning. Traumatic experiences also affect the parent-child relationship. Children are dependent upon the adults in their life to care for them and protect them. When children are harmed or not shielded from scary experiences, they sometimes have a hard time knowing who to trust. Children may have difficulty being away from their caregivers because they're afraid of what might be happening to them. Sometimes a child's experiences can affect how adults respond to them. They may each be reminders for each other if they shared a traumatic experience together. In general, when we are under stress, the parts of our brain responsible for planning, focusing, decision-making, and organizing are not as active. When children experience significant stress, they may have trouble learning. They may have delays in language, problems concentrating, and overall just a poor performance in school. Sadly, it would be very difficult to take a math test when you're worried about whether mom or dad are okay at home. Traumatic and scary experiences also affect how children think and understand the world around them. Children naturally experience egocentrism or difficulty with separating their sense of self from others. For example, for kids, something bad happened because they did something wrong. A child may feel he did not do enough to stop one of his parents from hurting the other. Over time, children can come to think that there is something wrong with them, or there is no one that they can count on, that their world is just unsafe. Overall, stressful experiences, especially those that are chronic, can result in a lot of overwhelming emotions, coupled with a lot of difficulty managing those emotions. Children may not have a caregiver that has served as a buffer to their emotions, or have been provided the opportunity to learn what to do when they are so mad or so sad. Some children will experience shame and guilt for reasons I mentioned a few slides ago. Children may automatically think bad things happen because they did something wrong. When children are exposed to anxiety-provoking situations, this can elicit feelings out of control, leading to worry about what's going to happen next or being on alert for signs of danger. When children are not exposed to corrective or experiences to help them recover from stress, they can start to feel hopeless, like nothing will get better, and this is just the way things are in my world. A lot of these emotional responses can make children feel incapable of managing their world. They rely on adults and caregivers around them for guidance on how to navigate what life throws at them. We like to use the idea of an emotional cup. Children have very small cups and they overflow very easily. Adults have bigger cups and they should catch the overflow of the child's. Traumatic experiences don't always result in the same behavior across children. This is just a list of behaviors that you may see as a result of trauma. Something to note is that trauma can alter our gauge of what we think is safe and unsafe. And so sometimes children may be at risk for engaging in or finding themselves in unsafe situations. I enjoy this quote just to keep in mind sometimes with children is just, what are they trying to tell me? Am I spending more time on figuring out how to punish them or how to react or respond versus stopping and just listening? What are they trying to tell me? What are they trying to communicate with me? So we want to share a little bit of the resources of where we, what we're going to talk about is the building blocks of a trauma-informed organization. And we want to share with you that these are resources that we have pulled from. These are nationally known organizations that focus on mental health and trauma in children. And so we wanted you to be aware of these are the resources that we're pulling from. And there's also going to be some other resources listed at the end of the presentation. But as we go into talking about these building blocks, we wanted to share with you where we were coming from and where we gathered our information. So there are 10 building blocks of a trauma-informed organization. And we don't have time today to go into all 10, but certainly they are there and you can see the words and they kind of make sense when you think about them. We've already covered a little bit of trauma awareness and education, identification of traumatic stress and what trauma can look like. We're going to spend some time now covering what does a safe environment look like? What are culturally responsive practices that we can use in our organization? How do we support our staff's wellness? Because we need to think about their safety and their wellness just as much as our children. and then talk about availability of trauma-specific intervention services. This is another organization that I learned about. This is an organization in West Virginia that created with the School of Law at Harvard 5 core ideas of helping traumatized children learn. And this is a picture of one of their manuals that they have created. There's actually 2 separate manuals, but I wanted to share with you just these 5 core ideas, and it fits right along with those building blocks of a trauma-informed organization. And many of them we have talked about. So traumatic experiences are prevalent. So we've already talked about that, specific even to Arkansas, of how prevalent trauma is with our children. Traumatic experiences can impact learning, behavior, and even relationships. Check, we've talked about those. Trauma-sensitive schools help children feel safe and learn. And those are key words that we want to focus on, to help a child feel safe so that they can learn. Trauma sensitivity requires a whole school effort. And we were so glad to see in the question earlier that we have some people that are from different levels of their school. So this takes from the superintendent to the teacher, the person who welcomes them in the door first thing in the morning, to the bus driver. And we're going to see a video about that in just a little bit. It's one of my favorites, about how every piece of that puzzle really is a part of the learning experience for the child. And then number 5, helping traumatized children learn should be a major focus of education reform. So this group, like I said, is out of the School of Law at Harvard, and they really work from also a law and policy perspective of how to adapt and change education reform to best support traumatized children. So I've been talking about all of the negative things that can happen following a traumatic life experience. So this has been the bad news story so far, and it's really only half the story. Good experiences are the other half of the story for many of us. Positive experiences with school and sports and good nutrition and experiences that build social skills, coping skills, and maybe most important, positive experiences in relationships. All of this contributes to resiliency, or the ability to bounce back, to beat the odds, survive despite the challenges. Does anyone know, and we don't have a poll for this, so you can say it out loud if you like where you are, does anyone know what the #1 resiliency factor is for a kid? It's one stable, supportive, and positive caregiver. Just one is a huge resiliency factor for a kid. I want to be clear about something though. Resiliency doesn't mean you were unaffected. It means that there is a healing happening, meaning made out of experiences and moving forward. The good news is that many folks with trauma are incredibly resilient. The other good news is that we can build resilience. One of the ways we can build resilience and avoid re-traumatizing individuals is by building a trauma-informed care environment in institutions like schools, their homes, their healthcare, social service agencies. We are going to spend the rest of our time today talking about what a trauma-informed healthcare agency looks like, how we become resilience builders. We become part of the solution instead of inadvertently being a part of the problem. Just trying to forward the slide here. Chad, I'm not getting it to go forward. Maybe you can help me. Oh, thank you so much. All right. Teachers and school personnel might be the first to have extended contact with many students outside of their family after this shelter-in-place order or stay-at-home order that we've had. This is a unique position to be aware of. to identify, respond to, and provide support around trauma and adversity. And also, if any of you are school-based mental health providers, you might be there with them as one of those first people that these kids are gonna have interaction with. There has been a buildup of trauma experiences and exposure for some of our children, particularly those who have trauma or have had adversity pre-COVID. African American and Latino children pre-COVID, just like Miss Alyssa mentioned earlier, there was Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Travion Martin, many other names. I want to give them respect and say their name, but there are many others. Those experiencing poverty. And then the pandemic happened. And on top of the pandemic, there was George Floyd. Children and families will be in different stages of processing all of this, and maybe recovery and healing from the impact of COVID and images and experiences of racial injustice. Trauma exposure, trauma symptoms, and related reactions can impact the precise ability areas that are required for academic learning, for their focus, attention, their memory, being able to comprehend what they're learning, just their brain develop overall, and just being available to learn, being present. A calm brain versus a stressed brain. Many of us may have experienced the stressed brain during COVID. That's impacted our ability to be emotionally controlled, remember what we have learned or other important information, and even remembering what day it is sometimes. And I think one of the other pieces we could have asked in the beginning is how many of you are parents? How many of you became a teacher in the last 3 months of school? So we've all had those dual roles together. The demand of the situation exceeds the child's or the family's ability to cope with it. Affects one's ability to stay focused, access their full brain, that executive brain, and be fully present so that they can learn. Changes the way people feel, think, and act towards themselves, the world, and even others around them. Traumatic stress symptoms and other reactions for preschoolers may be things like sleeping problems, concentration problems, anger, withdrawn, regressed, behavioral changes, crying. These may even be things that school administration will notice in children, that these are not the same kids that left our school in March. They're having a whole different set of symptoms. They look different. These kids have experienced a lot in the last few months. Trauma exposure among both students and school personnel. We want to be thoughtful about this. This is also about the school personnel, all of those people involved in these kiddos' lives. It's all relevant. Things we might want to do is to ask, listen, and watch. I'll talk a little bit about that. Ask. Have a clear and easy method for parents to access reports, things like formally assess the information available in public domain, like the number of COVID cases in their area, families impacted by unemployment, or their hours have been cut, or now they're experiencing food insecurity that they've never experienced before, domestic violence or marital discord, students with parents on the front line, parental stress, anyone in school family who lost a loved one or a death within school family, COVID or not related. Because during this time, if there was a death and we weren't able to attend a funeral, maybe it wasn't a death related to COVID. Maybe it was an expected death. Someone had been sick for a long time, but there was a time we couldn't even attend a service to be able to pay our respects and memorialize that person. Listen, not necessarily probe. So sometimes we don't need to ask questions. Sometimes we just need to listen. Listening, connecting, and showing interest, as you typically would, could lead to gaining a better understanding of that child or their family's experience. What was their experience during all of this? And then watch. Watch for any change in emotions or behaviors, academic or developmental milestones, such as regression, changes in their sleeping, their appetite, their school attendance, sharing, their ability to handle conflict, or even the parent's emotional state or stress level, their mood and demeanor or interactions. So each one of us probably come from different parts of the state, and how our community is impacted could be very different. We're all in the same storm, but not in the same boat. We had to do things similar, like wearing masks or not being able to enjoy activities that we used to enjoy. So we've all been in this same storm, even though we're not in the same boat. And now I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa.
Okay, thanks, Emily. So what I'm going to talk about for a little bit is what we refer to as the 4 S's of trauma-informed environments. So this includes supportive relationships. It includes physical, emotional, social, and psychological safety within environments, but also within those relationships, as well as how we can foster and strengthen a child's self-regulation and their social and emotional learning and development. And then towards the end of this presentation today, Emily's going to circle back and talk about self-care. And I'll see if this will advance for me. There we go. So some of the basic principles of what makes a safe environment include structure, predictability, consistency, and importantly, meaningful relationships with other people. So children with trauma histories often lack a sense of safety. They may come from unpredictable environments and situations. So we can help to regain and renew that sense of both physical and emotional safety. And we can do that by things like maintaining a consistent schedule, maintaining a routine, and being consistent in the ways that we interact with children. So children with trauma histories may worry about things that we aren't aware of. So like if they are going to be fed, just because they were fed one day, they can't assume they will be the next. So these children do better when schedules are predictable, and even better when they're given reminders about what's coming up. It's helpful when teachers have a daily schedule, one that's communicated both verbally and with visuals. So when things change, we have to do our best to communicate in advance of those changes. Sometimes even good changes, like field trips, can cause stress. It's different. So we have to remember that some children may need some extra help through transitions between activities, or when something does change in the daily or weekly schedule. Every child needs a person. Who is your person? If you were in a car accident, who would you call? And who's going to be a child's person? It might be you. It might be your co-teacher or the therapist that works down the hall from you. It might be the school nurse or the bus driver. It just needs to be somebody. So we need to focus on the positive with children, especially now. We have to be present, play, listen, offer comfort. We have to remember that what each of us brings into the moment matters. Children's brains form neural connections based on numerous interactions that occur over time, and each moment makes a difference. So it's no doubt that when any of us, including teachers, school staff, school personnel, mental health providers, you name it, we have what seems to be an infinite amount of demands, deadlines, both personally and professionally. And that makes it easier for our brain to resort to emotionally driven language. So as you think about the ways in which you have communicated with children, in the past, or perhaps the ways that you already communicate with children. Think about the messages that have incorporated permission to feel, acknowledgement of some of those big feelings, internal stress, and the idea that as a team, we can figure it out, we can make things better. So what are some common threats to psychological safety or emotional safety? Unfortunately, this happens all too frequently in the workplace, like sarcasm, lecturing, put downs, public humiliation, maybe using a negative tone of voice or body language, inconsistency, favoritism, and endless rules and regulations, treating people like children, like blaming and shaming. We know that as human beings, we value connection and relationships. Relationships are how people heal from trauma. Boundaries are clear, but we demonstrate that the value for developing meaningful relationships. So I mentioned earlier that this next school year is going to bring a numerous number of changes, kind of alterations in routines, unfamiliar procedures. So it's important to think about the routines that can be maintained. How can we make new procedures easy to remember? Possibly fun and engaging. Maybe singing the same song or singing the same set of songs when we're washing our hands. Recall that when the brain is under stress, both children and adults included, that it's harder to remember things. So the use of visuals, verbal and gentle reminders, and even concrete tasks that students can help with can help create a predictable and regular schedule. It offers a sense of control when other things are simply out of control. We also have to be cognizant of other aspects in the environment that may lend themselves to physical safety, the things that our senses respond to, like pictures or signs or language within the school, within the setting that might communicate exclusion or pose physical safety threats. For some children, they might be overstimulated. So we might ask ourselves, are the noise levels kept to a low volume? Are there signals or routines that can be implemented when the volume gets to be too loud? Are there spaces for children to calm or take a break if needed, talk it out, kind of utilize various coping skills? These are all really important things to keep in mind when we're trying to create and maintain a safe physical environment. Schools have been and are still planning for new procedures that they might need to implement within the school environment, like temperature checks, wearing masks, distancing desks, communicating with parents and students on a regular basis is going to help build that predictability and that routine. And providing rationales for why things are different is going to help to answer those questions that some children may not know how, who, or when to ask about. There will be some steps that you can take to be sensitive to children's individual triggers. But be aware that some triggers won't be obvious. So you want to be viewing child behavior through a trauma-informed lens at all times. Just because you cannot tell what triggered a child doesn't mean it wasn't a trauma reminder or the fact that their brain has been wired at this point to be on a trigger. Sometimes it can be a slight sense of hunger that triggers a child to remember the last time they were hungry and they didn't get to eat. So on the outside, a behavioral or emotional reaction can seem to have no cause when in fact it does. So remember, kids with trauma histories are at a brain-based disadvantage. It requires strong executive functioning skills, like Emily mentioned earlier, to do things like focus on a task, pay attention, or control impulses. So we know that children whose brain is chronically in flight or fight mode can't be fully exercising the part of their brain that helps support these skills. But the good news is that every one of these skills that you see can be taught. much like we teach reading or science or math. Each of us on this webinar today are still social and emotional learners. I'm still learning how to calm down in situations that make me angry. I still learn how to be a better listener, but sometimes we expect children to be able to do these things, just magically learn it. So I want you to ask yourself, from your perspective, are you willing to see that every behavior has a purpose? Teach the missing skill so children can form those social relationships with peers and other adults. In a trauma-informed organization and in a trauma-informed school, everyone needs to practice having that trauma-informed lens. So we have to shift our focus to what's wrong with you, or what is wrong with this child, to what has happened to this child. This is an important message for staff to think about when dealing with parents as well. Many parents have their own trauma history and might be struggling with their own emotional and behavioral difficulties. So not every behavior or emotion can be explained or caused by trauma, but trauma has to be a consideration. It has to be on the table. So this is the video that Emily mentioned earlier. And as Chad is pulling that up, I encourage you, as this video is playing, to think about the possibility that the child featured in this video is coming to school from a challenging and stressful home environment. What if he needed a caring adult? I want you to pay attention to the thoughts and feelings that you experience throughout this video. And the audio might be a little off on the video, so we are aware of that, and apologies for that.
How you doing? We need you inside. How do you think that makes us feel?
Back up a little bit, sorry.
Hey, Mr. Cute. Did you see that? Why would somebody do that?
Please go into the classroom. No talking. Quietly.
Hey, Miss Merida. How you doing?
We need you inside.
How do you think that makes us feel? I forgot my number.
What's your name?
Jordan?
What's your last name?
Carter?
Go ahead.
School is hard enough.
Come on in. Sit down quietly at your desk and begin writing.
This kind of stuff just makes it harder.
I said quietly, please. Who's talking? Is it you, Sophie? Don't let it be you.
Don't believe me?
Sophie.
Please just watch.
I'm not up here for me. I'm up here for you. Pay attention. Okay? Now somebody answer me. Somebody needs to answer me really fast.
Every time we're ignored or yelled at or silenced, the teacher takes away what's possible.
No horseplay, no running, and especially no talking.
Moment by moment.
Mr. Garrity, your student's behavior yesterday in the lunchroom, it was terrible. Next time, silent lunch. Did you hear that? Stay in line and catch a bubble. I'm not playing.
If this is education, we're in trouble. Bye, Miss McGarrity. Frederick Douglass said, once you learn to read, you'll be forever free. The way it is now, 2 of the 3 of us will never be able to really read. It doesn't have to be this way.
Hey, Jordan, how you doing?
Everyone we meet throughout our day can make a difference.
I've been waiting for you to arrive.
All the difference.
Good morning, Jordan.
How are you?
Oh, thanks for asking. How are you?
Good.
Go ahead and punch your number in.
Talk with us, not us.
That's okay. I'll look it up for you. Go ahead, sweetheart.
Okay.
All right.
Teach us what we need to know. That's how we get smarter.
Well, good morning, Sophie, Janicia, and Jordan.
And when you talk with us and teach us, give us bigger and bigger words.
Now what I'd like you to do, children, is turn around and converse with your neighbor and discuss where the mother might have gone.
Words that we can use to read and understand. She is prey for evil, so she hunts at night. And that will take us places we can never reach without it.
Remember, we're entering the learning zone. Now, how can we show our respect to the children and teachers who are working?
We can walk quietly.
Yes. Okay, kids, what I'd like you to do is continue writing your narrative, documenting your emotions if you were the baby owl and your mother abandoned you in the nest.
What can you do? Learn all that you can so that you can challenge us to be our best.
You would have stayed and assisted them in whatever they needed.
Share yourself with us and show us how to share ourselves with others. Give us courage. Give us compassion. Help us find our own voices so we can become who we are meant to be. Why would you want to silence us?
Okay. Hopefully you were able to pick up on what was happening in that video. Like Emily said earlier, this is also one of my favorite videos. And I oftentimes find myself smiling at the end of the video. And I encourage you as you watch that video, and that is also available on YouTube if you would like to rewatch it. It's called Every Opportunity. But what we really take away from that video is that every interaction that a child has with an adult, whoever that adult might be, it matters. So I challenge you to think about the commitment that you might be willing to make every opportunity matter. So just as schools are working to build or strengthen a trauma-informed approach, we need to involve and engage parents in this process. So we need to communicate, recognize positives, make eye contact, and genuinely show concern for what parents and their families might be experiencing or expressing. Just trying to advance. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So for some children, school is a secure base. It's a more structured and predictable environment, and it provides a sense of safety for some children. And school administrators and the rest of the school team must understand how trauma manifests in children. So putting the pieces of the puzzle together and staying curious about what a child's behavior might be communicating so we can better prepare. It's also important to educate parents about stress, trauma, symptoms of traumatic stress, and provide information related to the ways that parents can help children cope at home and prevent ongoing confusion or exposure to possibly disturbing information. So the resources that you see on this slide, like the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, has tons of resources available to both parents, professionals, and teachers. And so we have some of those resources that will be listed at the end of the webinar today. And My Teacher Wears a Mask is a social story that some individuals here at UAMS and through Arkansas State put together to help younger kids understand kind of what's going on, why they may come to school and see all their teachers and other adults that they knew before now wearing a mask. It's also important to communicate. So with parents, we have to communicate about anything we do know about opening and closing procedures, how schools are keeping children safe. We all have experienced kind of varying degrees of uncertainty, difficulty preparing, not having answers. And I want to highlight that it can be really frustrating for a parent to hear, "I don't know," as the answer. That can be anxiety provoking and uncomfortable to say as the person that is looked at, of who knows the answers, who should know the answers. But while this can be frustrating to hear, it communicates transparency, authenticity, and avoids making false promises and unsubstantiated expectations. And as much as possible, we have to aim to build and maintain positive relationships with parents, just as we would with students. So think of your relationship with parents as a piggy bank. We need to deposit money in the form of praise, respect, consideration, unassuming messages. So when things do change unexpectedly, when we can't plan and communicate about changes, we have a balance to withdraw from. We have built a balance and we have established the most positive relationship that we can so that we have a balance to withdraw. We have money to withdraw from that account. So in addition to the NCTSN website, Sesame Street and Communities has excellent resources, particularly for young children. So there's adult-specific videos, worksheets, games. And if you all haven't seen the belly breathing with Elmo video, you have to check it out. You might regrettably have that song stuck in your head for a few hours or days. I know I did. But it's a really fun and engaging way to teach deep breathing to children and help them cope. Some of you might be aware of this resource, but PBS for Parents also has excellent resources on trauma and different activities that you can incorporate within whatever setting that you work, whether that's school. This is also something that parents can use at home too. So just to reiterate what we have talked about so far, we have to turn parents into partners. Ask how families have been impacted, and possibly determine who within your school system or program can be a source of consultation, who parents can reach out to if they have questions. In 2016, the Arkansas Division of Child Care and Early Education launched a statewide program called Behavior Help. Some of you might be aware of Behavior Help, or some of you might have used it before. The main purpose of Behavior Help is to reduce suspensions and expulsions of young children. We know that students who are expelled or suspended from school early in life, as early as preschool, are more likely to have higher school dropout rates or greater juvenile justice involvement. And so I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about this, but I did include the link there at the bottom of the slide in case you were interested in learning more about Behavior Help and submitting a request for assistance. So schools can also help families connect with community and external organizations. So some families might have a history of trying to make ends meet or difficulty accessing food. And so being aware of what's available in your community can help lessen some of that major stress and meet those basic needs so that time and effort and resources can be dedicated more on coping and learning. So far, we have covered some aspects of what the foundational layers of the social emotional learning pyramid is. We know that when the bottom layers, the foundation is strong, intensive intervention is rarely needed. However, there are times when children need more. There are times when parents need more. So sometimes a student's behaviors and experiences necessitate extensive intervention and need services that the school just simply cannot provide, that the school is not equipped to provide or should not be equipped to provide. So a school's understanding about stressors that are occurring within a child's life, such as sleep difficulties, not only inform treatment services and should be addressed in treatment, but we know that sleep impairment will impact the child's functioning at school. So the school's regular communication with a child's provider is going to be extremely important in supporting that child. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what evidence-based practice means. When you hear evidence-based practice, This means that strategies, skills, coping, really the overall treatment approach has been found in research to demonstrate successful change and recovery. So basically, evidence-based practices are effective. They work. And I've mentioned the importance of parent involvement. Treatments for children, and especially young children, must include parents. Sometimes it's a misconception that people have that mental health providers are miracle workers or can magically visit with a child for an hour a week and quote unquote fix their child. But the fact is, we do not see changes in children. They don't receive the appropriate level of support and service when there's not a caregiver involved in treatment. So for example, if a 4-year-old is receiving mental health services and a parent is not involved in sessions or participating in treatment, that is not evidence-based practice. This doesn't mean that individual time with the therapist can't occur with the child, but it should not be what happens regularly. And there are often times when there are skills that children and families are taught outside of the school setting that can be reinforced in the school, such as deep breathing and specific and tailored strategies that children can utilize at school. I like to think of relating this idea to physical therapy or even visiting the dentist. You learn exercises in your physical therapy appointments, or you learn ways to practice good oral hygiene. And you're made aware of potential weaknesses or areas of growth. And then you're given instructions and homework to practice those outside of those appointments. So the same goes for evidence-based treatments with children. And the last thing I want to mention here is that evidence-based practice should involve generating goals and objectives to meet those goals. That therapy is not meant to last forever or indefinitely. There has to be some target. So we just have one last poll today. I'm going to have a little fun here. When you see the poll, I want you to select the answer that you think is the age that children can start participating in mental health services. So we'll give everyone just a few seconds to choose their answer. And some of you might know. Okay. So majority, about 38% of you chose 0, or that the fact that children can start participating in mental health services starting at birth. So that is in fact the right answer. And so it is okay if this is not something that you were aware of. This was actually a really surprising fact for me to learn that children can start mental health services with their caregivers starting at birth. So the treatments that you'll see on this next slide represent the child-specific evidence-based treatments that have been disseminated over the past 10 years throughout the state of Arkansas. And you might be able to see on the right-hand side that each of these target a slightly different age range of children. So I'm really gonna just briefly mention these 3. I won't have time to go into detail about them. But the first is child-parent psychotherapy, or CPP. And this is an evidence-based trauma and relational-based intervention for children ages 0 to 5 with trauma histories. And a major tenet of CPP is that children heal within the context of relationships. So consistent caregiver involvement is crucial. CPP has many goals, but we see that children and caregivers establish safety within their relationship. They learn how to express and regulate emotions. And what's nice is that research has shown that CPP also has reduced caregiver symptoms of PTSD, depression, and other mental health concerns. PCIT is an evidence-based treatment designed for children's ages 2 through 6. And the primary presenting concern is behavior management difficulties. And what's unique about PCIT is the therapist provides live coaching to the parent that is learning very specific and a structured set of skills throughout the course of treatment. And then TFCBT, or trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, is considered to be currently the gold standard treatment for children ages 3 through 18 with trauma histories. So TFCBT includes individual sessions with children and non-offending caregivers, and they learn various set of coping skills and education throughout the course of treatment. And what's really cool about TFCBT is that research supports its use in a variety of settings, including schools. So it's been shown to be effective for kids in foster care with autism spectrum disorder and for children of different cultural groups. And again, you might have noticed that I have bolded and underlined the bullet that contains the parent and caregiver involvement. We know that treatment is most effective when caregivers are involved. The last evidence-based treatment that I will quickly touch on today is cognitive processing therapy, or CPT. This is an evidence-based trauma-focused treatment for adolescents and adults. And the major focus of CPT is to help adolescents and adults process trauma that they've been through by identifying feelings, thoughts, and behaviors that are impairing and distressing. And so keep this one in mind if you have a parent who might benefit from therapy services. And then what you see here on this next slide is a visual depicting the different counties across the state of Arkansas that have evidence-based treatment trained providers. And so ARBEST throughout the past 10 years has worked incredibly hard and has been extremely successful with disseminating evidence-based treatments throughout the state to increase access to children and families who otherwise and historically had no access to trauma-based services. So we still have some more training to do. There's always more to learn and do, but we have had amazing results within the ARBEST team with disseminating treatments and creating access for children. If you would like to find a clinician that is trained in one of these evidence-based treatments, you can go to the ARBEST website and navigate to the clinicians list. You can find a clinician in your county that is trained in CPP, PCIT, TFCBT, or CPT. And you can search based on the county, the type of treatment, or even the therapist if you know of one. So I'm going to skip some of these slides just for the sake of time. At UAMS, there is a family medicine mental health provider checklist. This is a very helpful checklist for schools to have handy, but also to disseminate and distribute to parents. Those who are seeking trauma-based services outside of the school setting should not be afraid to ask these types of questions to a potential provider or clinic. So things like, what is the education and training background? What are the ages of children that they provide services to? What are the evidence-based treatments that are provided? And how will family and parents be involved? And especially asking about a provider's attitudes or approach regarding cultural sensitivity. There's not one right answer to look for, but there should be a consideration for these factors and openness and sensitivity to a particular family or child needs. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily to kind of bring us to the end of our webinar today.
Okay, so partnerships within the school system, and maybe we can even substitute those words school system to workplace, partnerships within your workplace. While it's important to provide compassion and support and care to those children and families that we serve, we must not forget about our own well-being and the well-being of those with whom we work, those that we surround ourselves with daily. Connecting within the workplace will without a doubt look very different right now. But the moments or even the attempts at opportunities to maintain a positive and supportive environment will make us more equipped to respond to the ongoing and daily challenges we are all facing. Now, obviously, we cannot connect with hands like we normally do. So I'm trying to get the slide to advance. We have a little bit different ways that we can use those handshake opportunities, handshake alternatives. You can do a quick elbow bump. You know, it's within 6 feet, but if you've got your mask on, you can do a quick elbow bump or a hip bump or whatever way you can maintain that type of connection. You know, I'm used to just smiling at people as I walk by, but you can't really see my face when I have that mask on. But coming up with a way to still feel connected to those that you work with and those that you're surrounded with daily. Enhanced supports for staff and for wellness. Being trauma-informed requires a thoughtful approach to supporting staff wellness. We've all talked for a long time about the high rates of burnout in the educational and mental health systems, and just the people helping field in general. And how do we avoid it? How do we keep those workers? How do we keep those great clinicians out there without keep them from getting burned out? There's actually another related concern I want to mention, and this can come up as we start to understand our students and staff more fully and listen and hear their stories. In some parts of our society, we build elaborate defenses to keep the difficult stories of others out of our line of sight. And as we start to really see and hear what's going on around us, it is embodied right in front of us, and it can be very overwhelming. And beyond burnout, we can actually begin to develop what is called secondary traumatic stress. About 30% of those who experience serious trauma will go on to develop symptoms of PTSD. Similar rates of STS are found among staff who work around a great deal of trauma. Symptoms are similar. Just like a person with PTSD will have symptoms like intrusive thoughts, which means they think about the event when they don't really want to, avoidance of any reminders of the trauma, or hyperarousal, which just means being on high alert a lot. These are also symptoms that someone with secondary traumatic stress can experience. What we want to do is engage in prevention. We want to aim for what one author describes as trauma stewardship. We want to enhance our ability to bear witness to trauma without sacrificing our own ability to live fully. To understand that we are affected by the suffering of others. The world will look and feel different to us the more we are exposed to the trauma of others. We have to find ways to be honest about how we are doing and finding a way to work that is sustainable. When we do that, we prevent not just secondary stress, traumatic stress, burnout, compassion fatigue, and all the other labels we give to distress our workforce is feeling. I've seen a lot of posts on Facebook recently where people have done a screenshot of something of their phone, some picture or something that's come up on their phone. And the first thing people want to comment is, why is your battery at 3%? Or why is your battery at 4%? You need to go charge it. We often take care of others or even other things better than we take care of ourselves. We let ourselves run out. Some of the things that we think about we can do, I know even in my work environment, we've had to do a lot of changing, because before I was one of the main people in our team that would, we called it the Sunshine Committee. So if someone had a birthday coming up, we would celebrate all together. We did potluck lunches every couple of months, or sometimes it was just, hey, let's all take our lunch into the break room and all sit together and eat. And those are things that we have to be more thoughtful about, or that we're not able to do. So we may have to just do things a little bit different. But still, these are times that we need to support each other and support our workforce and those around us. So some of the options are listed there. In closing, we're going to try one more video here that it's pretty good that I think will be good for us to end on. And just start thinking, if you have any questions or comments, you can go and put them in the chat area. And when we finish the video, then we'll look and see if you have any questions or comments to share for us. So we hope you enjoy this video.
You may have heard this word mindfulness. It's become something of a buzz phrase of late. So I'm going to give you one simple, serviceable definition, which is this. Mindfulness is the ability to know what's happening in your head at any given moment without getting carried away by it. Imagine how useful this could be. Just as an example, driving down the road, it's a traffic. How do you normally react? I think most of us normally react to a thought, which is, I'm pissed. And then what happens next? You immediately, habitually, reflexively inhabit that thought. You actually become pissed. There's no buffer between the stimulus and your reaction. With just a little bit of mindfulness, in that same situation, you might notice my chest is buzzing, my ears are turning red, I'm having a starburst of self-righteous thoughts, I'm getting angry. But you don't necessarily have to act on it and chase that person down the road, screaming at them with your kids in the back of the car thinking you've gone nuts. Now, you might be thinking, don't I need to get angry sometimes? Aren't I justified? I would say yes, but probably not as much as you think. The proposition here is not that you should be rendered by mindfulness into some lifeless, non-judgmental blob. The proposition is that you should learn how to respond wisely to things that happen to you, rather than just reacting blindly. And that, my friends, is a superpower. How do you get it? The way to get it is through meditation. I believe that meditation and mindfulness are the next big public health revolution. In the 1940s, if you told somebody you were going running, they would have said, who's chasing you? But then what happened next? The scientists swooped in, they showed that physical exercise is really good for you, and now all of us do it, and if we don't, we feel guilty about it. And that's where I think we're headed with mindfulness and meditation. It's going to join the pantheon of no-brainers like brushing your teeth, eating well, and taking the meds your doctor prescribed for you. Let me just close by saying, mindfulness is not going to solve all of your problems. It's not going to render your life a nonstop parade of unicorns and rainbows. Nonetheless, this is a superpower, and one that is accessible by you immediately.
Okay, so it's a superpower. I want to be able to just see if there's any, Chad, were there any questions that we wanted to address? I know we're running short on time.
Just a couple of folks have asked when this recording will be available, and so we'll try to upload it to the YouTube channel in 24, 48 hours. Sometimes technical things occur, but yeah, so if you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and there will be some links and an email that I send after the webinar for you as well. And the 4 resources that Emily kind of mentioned at the beginning, they are available as handouts, which you might have already found. You can download those files, and yeah, we're here for questions. So, and I'll
And there's
to our CEU slide quickly, then I'll back up to this question slide so you can jot down Alyssa and Emily's email. So the code for today's webinar is 1108, and I'll send in an email that has a survey link in there, and you'll be asked to enter that code. So go ahead and just write that down on a scratch sheet of paper, and when you get that email from me, you'll be able to enter your code and your CEU. And yeah, so any questions? I know we're probably at the top of the half hour here, so I'm going to leave this up for a few seconds. Just go ahead and jot this code down, and we're here to answer some questions.
Thank you all for joining. I just want to thank everyone for joining. I know everyone's busy these days, and this was a little bit longer webinar. We thank everybody for sticking in with us, and we just want to thank all of you for all of the work you do, all of the professions, you know, everything that you're doing. We just really appreciate all the things you're doing for the kiddos and families out there.
All right. Well, one kind of question that did come in is a lot of the resources we've shared are classroom specific. Emily and Alyssa, thoughts on could those easily be translated over to the home environment where a lot of our students will be doing virtual learning? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So really those resources that we mentioned in the webinar are things that can be generalized to the school and tailored to the school environment, but those are also things that parents can read and learn about. There's a lot of parent-friendly articles, handouts, videos on kind of various websites that make it easy for parents to implement those things at home. Again, it's really important for parents to be involved in treatment. So if there is a particular coping skill or strategy that a mental health provider is teaching in a session, they should be able to help kind of problem solve how to use that within a virtual learning, even at home. And that's why it's also really important for the school to be in communication with parents and even mental health providers so that they can kind of work out a plan. If a child is needing a break, if a child is having trouble focusing, if they become dysregulated, it's really important to maintain that open line of communication and collaboration so that there can be a kind of coping plan in place. I hope that answers the question or helps.
I think it does. I'm seeing a lot of thank you, appreciate the information. Well, Emily and Alyssa, thank you for today's presentation. I'll leave this slide up here for a little bit. Folks want to jot down emails, and hope everyone has a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.